Okay, so I want to knock this little video out to explain how it can be the case that there's no such thing as free will, and yet it's also true that psychological growth is possible and that you can engage in a successful self-improvement project of some kind and change your mind over time, et cetera, et cetera. And this is because I'm preparing for a debate with a psychologist who basically thinks everything I say is wrong. So that should be fun. Anyway, first, let me explain what I mean by free will and the lack thereof. It's really simple. From a purely scientific point of view, we live in a universe that is whatever, let's say 99% deterministic and 1% random. And I'm sure that percentage is probably wrong, but it's something like that. And people have they have a total misunderstanding of what determinism means. They imagine that it means that some outside force is controlling you or dictating your actions to you. And that's not what it means at all. That's called fatalism, the notion that fate is dictating the course of events, not you. But in determinism, you are dictating the course of events. It's just that your choices are perfectly predictable if enough information was available about everything that happened before. So let me make this more clear, okay? What we're saying here is that even though you feel like you're choosing when you choose something, and indeed you are choosing, right? But the false belief that you have when you feel like you're choosing is, I chose A, but I could have chosen B, right? I chose to eat an apple, but I could have chosen to eat an orange. But this sort of thought is not based in reality. It's just an imagination. And it's an imagination primarily based in the desire to see oneself as a sort of free agent that somehow stands outside the system. Meaning to say everything else in existence is determined. Meaning, like, if we had supercomputers that could absorb enough data points, we could perfectly predict the weather. Our failure to perfectly predict the weather at this point in our technological development has to do with processing power, nothing else. It has to do with the difficulties involved in gathering the amount of data points that would be needed to perfectly predict the weather for each geographic point on Earth. That is a massive amount of data. And even though our supercomputers are pretty super, they're not super enough for that yet. But they could be, should we choose to devote our attention to that as our primary intellectual and computational challenge, right? So in the same way, then, everything in the world, right, is determined by causes and conditions. Everything, and everything is deeply embedded in a matrix of causes and conditions. Nothing stands outside of it. And we understand that perfectly well, intuitively, when we look around at the world. A cloud is not some independent entity. It's part of an ecosystem that determines how much moisture is in that cloud at any given moment. And yet, on the basis of your ego, I have to call it that, I'm afraid, you want to imagine that you are an independent entity that somehow stands outside of the system and that can make choices not determined by all the causes and conditions that literally determine everything else in the universe. So if that's not hubris, I don't know what is. So basically, this teaching that there's no free will and there's not even an illusion of free will boils down to the following: that you have to choose what seems like the best option available to you, given the information and resources that you have at the time of choosing. Meaning you're helpless to do otherwise. You have to choose what seems like the best option available to you in any given moment that a choice is possible, right? And you will go on choosing what seems like the best option available to you at any given moment. And again, if we had a supercomputer that could calculate your total psychological history and quantify it in various ways, as well as your biological state in that moment and other factors, then we could perfectly predict what that choice would be, meaning we could perfectly predict what would seem like the best option available to you before you, in fact, make the choice. And yet the choice is still real. You're not an automaton in the sense that you're not being controlled by some external force, unless that external force is simply the entire universe. But the universe can't be abstracted as an entity, right? It's an infinitely complex matrix of interrelated phenomena that we can describe in terms of cause and effect, even though that's overly reductionistic. Okay, so this might sound all very, very scientific, and it is, but what does this have to do with my area of speciality, which in fact isn't science, though I flirted with that possibility for some time. My field of speciality, of course, is tantric philosophy and Indian philosophy, but it does relate. In fact, it relates very much. The reason for that is that the tantric tradition says there's no such thing as an individual agent. There's only one agent of all actions, and we call it Shiva. So can you see how that is simply a religious way of saying the exact same thing that I've already been saying? The tradition clearly asserts that individual agency is an illusion. There is no separable individual agent with its own separable willpower. There's only one agent, meaning to say one actor who performs all actions. Now, this can be anthropomorphized and imagined as a deity, as a person, a divine person, right? But in the non-dual version of Tantra, we need not imagine it in that way. It's just a way of saying that nothing has individual agency, and you can call the whole universe, the matrix of the whole, the pattern of the whole, and a capital A agent, if you want. And indeed, religious people did want to do that because they saw spiritual benefit in conceptualizing it in that way. If you conceptualize the universe as a being, then it invites this possibility of surrender, not my will, but thine, O Lord. And it turns out that for most people, because of the way human psychology is constituted, for most people, there is great benefit to that very, that is to say, most people couldn't arrive at the same sense of beatitude, at the same sense of peace, acceptance, and ability to go with the flow without the religious understanding of this. Most people couldn't arrive at that very, very different affective state and different paradigm of being through the logical arguments I've just outlined, but some people can. So whatever way works, and that itself is a tantric principle, the principle of Upaya, skillful means or effective method, also known as whatever works. That is to say, any method that's in some way aligned with the truth that can bring about the desired goal, in this case, peace and joy, acceptance, and ability to go with the flow, that is a legitimate method, whether it's religious or scientifically logical, right? Okay, so the point here is, again, very simple. It's the realization, and this, I'm inviting this as an actual realization, not just a thought, right? The realization that the concept I chose A, but I could have chosen B is nothing but science fiction, that you would always choose whatever you chose, no matter how many times you rewind time to that moment, you're always going to choose the same thing because the factors that feed into the making of that choice are exactly the same. So if you would always choose the same thing, no matter how many times you rewind time, then how is it true to say I chose A, but I could have chosen B? It's simply not. And here, of course, we're talking about actually rewinding time. You wouldn't have the memory of having chosen as a factor. That would be time travel, which is different and probably impossible. Anyway, point is, what this boils down to in lived experience is the realization that you can't choose to think before you can't choose what to think before you think it, right? And you can't choose what to desire or who to desire. You can't choose your desires at all, right? They just arise. You don't get to select them in advance or deselect them, perhaps more to the point. But also, you can't choose what sorts of thoughts seem compelling to you and what sorts of thoughts do not seem compelling, you see? So therefore, your actions are also part of this automatic process, the spontaneous unfolding of consciousness, I call it, or the universe, someone else might call it. The spontaneous unfolding of the pattern of being includes your actions, and it's spontaneous only in the sense that it's not being controlled by somebody. There's no puppet master on top, right? But it's not spontaneous in the sense that everything that happens because of its intimate interrelation with causes and conditions, right? So in that way, then, how do you decide which thoughts to act on? Well, you act on the thoughts that seem compelling to you. And how do you decide which thoughts seem compelling to you? You don't, do you? That's interesting to think about. You can't, right? Thoughts just seem compelling or they don't. And if they seem compelling, you act on them. So how are your actions really freely chosen? They're actually just part of the same pattern or matrix of being as everything else, and they're determined in the same way as everything else. So you are not separable from this whole pattern as much as you might like to be. You wouldn't really want that, by the way, because that would be the ultimate loneliness imaginable, which is not what anyone wants. Okay. So the point here is, and I have a whole blog on this, you can't choose how you react to anything. The reaction just happens. And you can't choose whether or not it seems like a good idea to change your reaction, right? Which you can do over time. How? Well, you can recondition yourself. You can, or to be more accurate, of course, the mind can recondition itself. And if the mind reconditions itself by giving itself new inputs, by focusing attention in different ways, et cetera, then the mind can change itself. It can reconfigure, rejigger itself. Now, then you have a changed mind. Then you have different reactions. So when you say, I can choose my reactions, if you mean I could engage in a process by which over time, my mind reconfigures itself such that my habitual reactions are different a year from now, then I say absolutely true. Though, of course, you can't choose whether that prospect is compelling to you or not. It just is. But if you mean, when you say I can choose my reactions, if you mean I can choose how to react in this moment, I say, well, obviously not. Or you would always choose to react in the best possible way, and you don't, do you? If you're honest, right? Okay. So we can't choose to be different in any given moment. This is the point of coming to the main point of the video. In fact, this has all been prefatory, I'm afraid. You can't choose to be different in any given moment, but you can choose to engage a process that, you know, causes you to be different later. Right. And it's the easy way to understand this is to imagine a tennis match that's about to commence. Okay, it's 1 second before the tennis match starts. At that moment, the outcome is already determined. If we had, again, if we had all the data, we could perfectly predict it. Not only who will win, but by how much they will win. And that's because at that moment, each player has done the training that they've done. They've gotten as much sleep as they've gotten. They feel as well as they do. They're as free from viruses and infections as they are or aren't. You see what I mean? All the factors are already in play. And so as soon as you press go, the outcome is already determined, you know. And the only way it could be different is if one of the players had done more training or gotten better sleep or whatever, which is impossible, of course, to alter in the second before the match begins. Because again, no time travel. Do you see? But everything's like that. Now, if that player wants to make their chances better of increase their chances of winning at some future match, then they'll train more. But the idea of winning a future match is going to be exactly as compelling as it is to that person. And if it's sufficiently compelling, they'll train a lot. And if it's not, they'll train less. And they don't get to choose that. It just happens, right? Even if it feels like a choice. Okay. So for those of you who already understand this, who think I've repeated myself, I have repeated myself because most people don't understand this at all. Now, the psychologist with whom I'm going to have a debate sometime soon, he says that I'm being irresponsible in teaching this doctrine of, you know, no free will, or the illusion of free will is illusion. Because then it implies that people can't change for the better and so on and so forth. And I hope that you've seen in what I've said already that objection is nonsense, right? It's perfectly possible for people to change themselves more or less rapidly, depending on how inspired they are to do so, which again is not something they can choose. But understanding this doctrine is a win-win if you actually understand it, because it doesn't prevent psychological growth or self-improvement or beneficial changing of any kind, but it does allow for profound self-acceptance. The person who understands this will deeply understand that they couldn't have chosen differently at any point in the past, and they couldn't be different from how they are right now. It's literally impossible. And if they really get this on a deeper than conceptual level, then there's a profound relief as they enter into this really sublime, total self-acceptance, because they know in their bones they couldn't be different from how they are now. This doesn't get them off the hook for working on themselves for the future, but they couldn't be different from how they are now. And if the idea of working on themselves is not sufficiently inspiring to produce dramatic change, well, they are off the hook for that because they couldn't help the level of inspiration that they were able to access. Okay, so I hope this all makes sense, right? Change is indeed possible, but you couldn't be different from how you are now in this moment. And you couldn't have chosen anything differently in the past. You couldn't have done anything differently. So profound self-acceptance is simply sanity. It's sanity and awareness of the nature of reality. It's the natural result. If you don't have profound self-acceptance, you don't realize the truth about reality yet, or you're not sane. Okay? Which someone who does realize the truth about reality can also accept. Okay, so last thing then is what the word you denotes, or me, I, whatever pronoun we're using, you know? Because when we say you can change yourself, we are, of course, equating the pronoun with the body mind. The body mind can recondition itself if it becomes convinced that reconditioning is a good idea. But is that the real you? No, the Tantric tradition says quite clearly, in this part, I think you already understand well, that the real you is simply consciousness itself. And consciousness itself wills itself into being as the substance of every experience whatsoever, in every moment whatsoever, right? So there is a will to consciousness. It's not just a passive witness in the Tantric tradition. It's not just a passive witness standing back and observing everything. Consciousness is actually becoming the substance of every experience whatsoever. And it wills that, sort of hinges on what we mean by the word will. But it's sort of true that consciousness wants to experience itself in the way that it is in every given moment. Okay, so that is a difficult thing to try to explain. I'm not going to try to do it now. I would make the video too long. And it's something that needs to be directly experienced in non-dual awareness. But the point here is that consciousness is that which is constantly pervading the whole of experience in every moment, constantly becoming the whole of experience in every moment, constantly providing the context for the whole of experience in every moment, right? And if we're correctly using the word you or me to refer to that which we fundamentally are, which is consciousness itself, then we have to use different sorts of language, right? Because consciousness cannot be changed. It can't be fundamentally altered. It's constantly changing in the sense of becoming the substance of each experience, each moment to moment, and that includes what we call change. But consciousness itself cannot change, and none of its fundamental parameters can change, right? And so maybe it's enough if I stop there and you tease out the implications for yourself. If you're evaluating, you know, the truth value of any statement that uses a personal pronoun like I or you, you have to determine what the refers to in that context. So yeah, I'll leave it there for now. Maybe there'll be a sequel to this. Okay, hope that was thought-provoking and helpful for you. See you next time. Om.